We all should have seen this clip on screen. These highlights on screen from Ben Whittaker versus Khaled Gradia went completely viral over the internet. It was all over Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, whatever. Some people just know him as the boxer who does those funny dances, who has the really good head movement. But among boxing fans, he's quite a controversial figure. Some people think his showboating is disrespectful and unsportsmanlike. Others just find it funny and entertaining. Some think he's going to go on to do great things in the sport, and some people think he's just rubbish. And he will lose once he fights someone good. So I'm here to give you a detailed answer based on his career so far. Ben Whittaker started boxing a bit later than most, at about 15 years old. He was quite a talented young boxer. He won a silver medal at the 2015 Youth Commonwealth Tournament. Before he fought in any major amateur tournaments, he already had a wealth of experience, fighting guys like Alexander Kizniak, who's arguably the best amateur on the planet right now, and Whittaker was only 20 years old when he fought him. Being pushed straight into the deep end against a machine like Kizniak would prepare him well for his first major tournament in 2018 in the Commonwealth Games. He made it to the quarterfinals of that tournament against Scotsman John Doherty. It was a very, very close fight, Whittaker having the more clean work, whereas Doherty had the rougher work. But unfortunately, amateur judges, being how they are, gave the decision to Doherty. But Whittaker could not let that discourage him. He'd make it to the quarterfinals again in the next major tournament that he'd take part in, being the 2019 Yekaterinburg tournament in Russia against Australian Jerome Pampelon, who he'd soundly outbox for 3 rounds and make it to the semi-finals, where he'd face Dilshodbek Rusmatov. Unlike his loss to Doherty, this loss was fair enough. The more experienced Uzbek simply being the better boxer, outboxing Whittaker soundly in all 3 rounds of the fight. Whittaker would, as usual, put on a decent account of himself, but the judges agreed that Rusmatov was the clear winner. Whittaker did not have the time to be discouraged by the loss, because he would then have a massive opportunity in front of him in the form of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. He would successfully make it through all qualifying matches. He'd make it to the quarterfinals where he'd beat Brazilian Keno Machado, and he'd make it to the semi-finals where he'd be matched up against Russian monster Imam Khatayev. Khatayev was one of the favourites to win the whole tournament. Even with those heavy amateur gloves, he was producing knockouts at the highest level. So it was a very hard task for Whittaker, but it's one that he came through. Whittaker displayed that great defensive movement that we know him for. Despite the strength difference, Whittaker would have the speed advantage with his feet and with his hands. It was still a decently close fight because Khatayev is very, very good. But Whittaker would score enough clean punches and avoid enough damage to win the decision and make it to the finals. In the finals, he'd be matched up against an even harder opponent, in legendary Cuban Alan Lopez. Not only was Lopez more experienced than Whittaker, he has Cuban footwork combined with knockout power, and it would take a real talent to beat him. The fight begins and Lopez's superior timing is already apparent. Whittaker's movement was nothing new for Lopez, who was already a veteran of hundreds of fights. But it was a genuinely competitive effort from Whittaker, with Lopez simply being the better man with the superior timing and superior experience. So Lopez would go on to win the gold, leaving Whittaker with the silver medal. A silver medal will be a massive achievement for anyone else on the planet, but Whittaker would refuse to take anything below first place, and he'd refuse to even wear the medal. That would be Whittaker's last amateur fight, and he'd then make the decision to turn professional in 2022. Whittaker would choose to sign with Boxer on Sky Sports, where for his professional debut he'd be matched up against 6-6 Greg O'Neill. Since his competition now isn't as fierce as it was in the amateurs, Whittaker now had the opportunity to show off his showboating skills and proceed to knock out O'Neill in the second round. An overall impressive performance. Whittaker would be given a big stage for his second pro fight, which would be held on the Joshua Usyk 2 undercard, where he was matched up against undefeated 6-0 Croatian Peter Nozic. It wasn't as one-sided as his debut, but he'd win every round of the fight. He'd return to the UK for his third fight, and he'd begin the tradition of his flashy Prince Nassim Hamed-inspired ring walks. That fight would be against Jordan Grant, who was a bit of a step down from Nozic, and he was so many levels above his opponent at this point that Whittaker would just showboat as much as he possibly could. And this is where the criticism comes in, because while it is entertaining, Jordan Grant is someone who has lost to Tommy Fury. This is not a threat to Whittaker whatsoever. But I'm not here to talk about the morals of showboating. This video is about boxing. And even though it's expected, Whittaker did look really good in that fight. With Whittaker now being 3-0, his next fight would be against Vladimir Belushki. This is the first fight where Whittaker's powers started to come into question, because even though Belushki was getting hit many, many times very clean by Whittaker, it wasn't until the 8th round where Belushki would actually be stopped. And Belushki is someone who has been stopped before. But you can argue that Whittaker just showboated too much and that's why he didn't get the finish until later on. For his 5th fight, he'd be matched up against Stevan Zlehaj, who had a modest record of 11-2. Whittaker was his usual self for the most part. before making people question whether he really had no power by knocking out Jiddehaj clean in round 4, which is still the best knockout of his career. Following that, we go into this year, 2024, where in February he'd fight Khaled Gradier, the clip we've all seen before, which seemed to put Whittaker on the map. Whittaker had now made a real name for himself in boxing, and he'd fight again the following month against Leon Willings. Willings had a record of 7-1 at the time, with that one loss being at the hands of an 8-19 opponent. So Whittaker was expected to walk through this guy. But despite a good start from Whittaker where he dropped Willings early on, Whittaker actually found himself getting caught a few times in the fight by Willings, which is the first time this has really happened to him in the pros. Now overall it was a one-sided fight. Whittaker did drop him and basically win every round, but he was expected to put more of a statement on. You can argue that Whittaker's just been in showboating mode the entire time he's been a professional, but in the second half of the fight I thought Whittaker had to start fighting a bit more seriously. But anyway, he'd win the decision, and we move on to his most recent fight against 12-0, 10 knockouts, Ezra Aranyeker. Aranyeker being his most dangerous opponent so far, but if the justification for Whittaker not getting the knockout in the Willings fight was that Willings was too negative, the African was the complete opposite. Whittaker still failed to find the knockout. Much like the Willings fight, it was a good performance overall, but the most dramatic moment of the fight was probably the headbutt. Now I do believe that Whittaker, if he fought seriously, probably could have gotten the knockout over Ezra, because he did almost get it in the last round. But a serious Whittaker is something I've yet to see. And this takes us to the present day, where he's scheduled to face Liam Cameron on the Bivol vs Beterbiev undercard. Cameron is not going to beat Whittaker, but it's an interesting measuring stick fight to see how Whittaker compares to guys like Lyndon Arthur. So in terms of actually evaluating how good Ben Whittaker is and his skill set, his Olympic silver medal as a result of his win over Imam Hatayev in the Olympics is a very, very legitimate achievement. And it sort of speaks for itself as to why Whittaker's not just a hype job. I think Whittaker's natural athleticism and his natural defensive ability are both things that can take him to the highest level in the sport. But I don't think he's that good. If we assume that Whittaker's not going to mess around when he starts fighting elite level fighters, we're looking at a good outside rangy boxer with a good jab, a good straight right hand, who can mix it up to the body as well. But we've seen him fight the same sort of opponent too many times. I do rate him talent-wise above the likes of Willie Hutchinson and Callum Smith, but the question of whether his style will work against more dangerous guys like Joshua Buatsi, Anthony Yard, and particularly Beterbiev, who's an entirely different conversation, it then becomes a question about his defence, his conditioning and his chin. His defence being something I actually see an issue with, because while his style of defence worked for him in the amateurs, I'm not sure it's going to work for him in the professional game. And I can explain. I see a lot of similarities between the styles of Shakur Stevenson and Ben Whittaker. Shakur being a much more refined version of it. Shakur never really steps out too far or admires his work after slipping a punch or landing a really good combination. Instead, he maintains the centre of the ring to continue consistent pressure. Also see how Shakur's defence is not just based around reflexes, but also based around physical defence. He doesn't just physically move away from the punch, he also keeps a high guard in order to maintain his defence. And we can see him getting clipped by Leon Willings as a result of that issue, which happened several times over the course of the fight. So I think he can either lose as a result of this, or fix it, then become an elite level fighter. So, in conclusion, is Ben Whittaker good? Yes, he's very good. But he does have some bad habits that he needs to fix, in my opinion, in order to reach the top. Goodbye.